I remember it so vividly, like a photograph burned into my mind. The crackling of the fireplace filled the silence, the warmth of the room wrapping around us like a soft cocoon. Ryan, my husband of 10 years, sat across from me on the couch, his face illuminated by the soft, flickering light. It was the kind of quiet evening that felt timeless, where nothing could disturb the fragile peace of the moment, or so I thought. He looked at me with an expression I couldn't place, his eyes darting away from mine for just a second too long. I thought it might be stress from work, or maybe one of those late-night musings about life that he sometimes shared. But when he finally cleared his throat, his words weren't anything I could have prepared for. "Layla," he started, his voice steady but strangely measured. "I've been thinking about something, about us." I smiled, bracing myself for what I assumed was a conversation about a vacation, or maybe the usual talk about bills. Instead, what he said next made my chest tighten and my hands freeze in place. "What would you think about spending time with someone else?" I stared at him, my breath caught somewhere between disbelief and shock. "What do you mean, spending time?" I asked, forcing a nervous laugh, waiting for him to grin and tell me it was a joke. But his face stayed serious. "I mean," he said slowly, finally meeting my eyes, "what if you connected with another man? Just for one night?" I froze. My heart pounded so hard, I thought it might echo in the room. This was Ryan, the man who once got jealous because a waiter smiled at me for too long. The same Ryan who had always been my protector, my best friend. And now he was suggesting what? I tried to find words, but they escaped me. Before I could process it, he continued, his voice calm, as though he'd thought this through for weeks. "There's this guy, Marcus. We work out at the same gym. I think he'd be perfect." Perfect. The word hung in the air, and for a moment, I thought I might be dreaming. Marcus? I knew who he was, tall, self-assured, with a presence that turned heads the moment he walked into a room. But Ryan? How could he even think about something like this? "Ryan, have you lost your mind?" I snapped, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. I stood up, the blanket on my lap sliding to the floor. "This is insane." But he didn't back down. He stayed seated, his expression unreadable. "Just think about it," he said softly, almost pleading. "I wouldn't suggest this if I didn't believe it could bring us closer." Closer. That word again, wrapping around me like a whisper I couldn't escape. What could he possibly mean by closer? How could involving another man, a man I barely knew, bring us closer? The room felt smaller, the air heavier, and as I stared at him, I couldn't help but wonder, was this the beginning of the end? Or was there something about us, about him, that I hadn't seen before? That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying his words over and over in my mind. I didn't want to admit it, but something in the way he spoke, in the way he looked at me, planted a tiny, unsettling seed of curiosity that I couldn't ignore. And as much as I wanted to push it away, the shadow of his suggestion stayed with me, lingering in the quiet spaces of my thoughts. I didn't know it then, but this was only the beginning of something that would test everything I thought I knew about trust, loyalty, and myself. They say 10 years of marriage can either feel like a lifetime or the blink of an eye. For Ryan and me, it was both. We had built a life together, a home, shared memories, and a bond that had weathered storms. But somewhere along the way, the laughter that used to echo through our house had softened, replaced by the quiet hum of routine. Don't get me wrong, Ryan was still my husband, my partner, and my friend. But there were moments, more frequent lately, where I'd catch him staring off into space, his jaw tight, his thoughts locked away in a place I couldn't reach. Conversations felt shorter, his touches felt distant. It wasn't that he didn't care, at least I didn't think so. It was just that somewhere in the busyness of life, we'd started coasting, moving side by side, but not really together. I wasn't blind to it. I could feel the gap growing between us, a quiet, unspoken void that neither of us knew how to cross. I tried to tell myself it was normal. 10 years is a long time after all. But part of me missed the man who used to light up when I walked into the room, the one who'd pull me close just because. And then there was Marcus. I'd heard his name before, always in passing, Marcus this and Marcus that. He was Ryan's gym buddy, someone he'd casually mentioned now and then. I never thought much of it until the day Ryan invited him over for dinner. I didn't know what to expect, but the moment I opened the door, I understood why Marcus had a way of commanding attention. Tall, broad-shouldered, and impossibly confident, Marcus had a presence that was hard to ignore. His smile was warm, his voice rich, and he carried himself with an ease that seemed to fill every corner of the room. He made jokes, asked thoughtful questions, and somehow managed to make me feel like I was the most interesting person in the world, something I hadn't felt in years. Ryan, on the other hand, seemed unusually quiet that night, watching us more than he participated. At first, I thought nothing of it, but as Marcus's laughter mingled with mine, I felt Ryan's eyes linger a little too long, his silence pressing down on me like an unanswered question. Marcus didn't just bring energy into the room, he brought something else, something I wasn't ready to name. And as the evening unfolded, I couldn't shake the feeling that his arrival wasn't just coincidence. Ryan seemed different after that night. More thoughtful, maybe, or more calculated. The distance I'd felt before was still there, but now it carried a weight I couldn't define. And in the quiet moments, I found myself wondering if he'd seen something in me that night, something even I hadn't noticed. Was it Marcus? Was it us? Or was it something else entirely? When you've been married for 10 years, you think you know your partner, you think you know yourself, but sometimes, all it takes is one unexpected moment to make you question everything. So, let me ask you this. Do you think long-term relationships lose their spark naturally, or do we lose it by not paying attention? I'd love to hear your thoughts because, honestly, I was starting to question my own. I remember sitting on the couch that evening, the glow of the fireplace casting shadows across the room. It was one of those quiet nights where the world outside seems to hold its breath, and the only sound is the ticking of the clock on the wall. Ryan sat across from me, his hands clasped together, his expression unreadable. I thought it was just another night. I thought I knew what to expect after 10 years of marriage. He cleared his throat, breaking the stillness, and looked at me with an intensity that made my stomach tighten. "Layla," he began, his voice steady but careful, "there's something I've been thinking about." I braced myself for the usual, something about work, bills, maybe even a half-baked plan for a weekend getaway, but nothing could have prepared me for what came next. "What would you think," he said slowly, as though testing each word, "about spending time with someone else?" At first I laughed, a nervous, uncertain sound that hung in the air. "Spending time, like with friends?" I asked, searching his face for the punchline, but there was no humor in his eyes. "No," he said firmly, his gaze locking onto mine. "I mean, with another man, just for one night." I froze, the weight of his words pressing down on me like a lead blanket. "What are you talking about?" I asked, my voice sharp, my mind racing to keep up. Ryan leaned forward, his tone soft but unwavering. "I've been reading about couples who do this. They say it brings them closer, reignites the spark, and I think it could be good for us." My heart was pounding so hard I thought he might hear it. "Closer? Good for us? How could this possibly be good for us?" And then he said it, the name that made everything even more surreal. "There's this guy, Marcus. We work out at the same gym. I think he'd be perfect." Marcus. His name hit me like a jolt. I'd only met him once, but I remembered him vividly. His confidence, his presence, the way he seemed to fill a room without even trying. And now Ryan was suggesting, "Him?" I stood up so quickly the blanket on my lap tumbled to the floor. Ryan, have you lost your mind? I snapped, the words tumbling out before I could even think. This is insane. But Ryan didn't flinch. He didn't back down. Instead, he stayed seated, calm, like he'd been preparing for this conversation for weeks. I'm not saying you have to decide right now, he said, his voice maddeningly composed. Just think about it. Think about it. The words echoed in my head, hollow and absurd. How could he even suggest such a thing? Was he bored? Was he tired of me? Was this his way of telling me I wasn't enough? That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, while Ryan slept soundly beside me, as though he hadn't just turned my world upside down. His words replayed in my mind, over and over, until they blurred into the one question I couldn't escape. Why? Was this some misguided attempt to save our marriage? To fix something he thought was broken? Or was there something deeper, something I hadn't seen until now? Tell me, would you ever entertain such a suggestion? Could you even imagine what it would feel like to hear those words from someone you love? Because in that moment, I wasn't sure whether to fight for us or to walk away entirely. I'll never forget the moment Marcus stepped into our home. It was a Saturday evening, the kind of evening that should have been unremarkable. I was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables, trying to pretend this was just a regular dinner with a friend of Ryan's. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. When the doorbell rang, I heard Ryan greet him with an enthusiasm that felt off. Their laughter filled the hallway, casual and familiar, but when I stepped out of the kitchen and saw Marcus standing there, it was like the air shifted. He was taller than I'd remembered, his presence somehow larger, more commanding. He had this ease about him, the kind of confidence that wasn't forced, but earned. His smile was warm, his handshake firm, and for a moment, I was caught off guard. Layla, he said, his voice rich and smooth, it's a pleasure to finally meet you. I managed a polite smile, telling myself it was just a dinner guest, just one evening. But as the night unfolded, it became clear Marcus wasn't like anyone I'd ever met. He was funny in a way that made you forget your own insecurities, charming without trying too hard. He asked me questions, real questions, about my hobbies, my thoughts, my dreams, and when I answered, his attention didn't waver. He listened, really listened, like what I said mattered. Ryan, meanwhile, seemed content to sit back and watch. At first, I thought he was just letting Marcus and I get acquainted, but the way his eyes lingered on us, how he nodded approvingly at every shared laugh, made my skin prickle. It wasn't just dinner, it was something else entirely. When Marcus complimented my cooking, I thanked him, feeling a small flicker of something I hadn't felt in years. Appreciation, maybe. Or was it more than that? I told myself I was imagining it. But as the evening wore on, his attention lingered. His compliments became softer, more personal. After dinner, when Marcus left, Ryan turned to me with that same unnerving calm he'd had the night he first brought up this idea. "He's a great guy, isn't he?" he asked, his tone almost too casual. I crossed my arms, trying to suppress the unease rising in me. "It was just dinner, Ryan," I said sharply, but he only smiled. "You two get along really well. That's a good thing, Layla." The way he said it, so matter-of-fact, sent a chill through me. I couldn't tell if he was oblivious to the tension in the room or if he'd orchestrated the entire evening. The next morning, I woke up to a text from Marcus. "Thanks for the great dinner last night. Ryan's lucky to have you." I stared at the message, my heart pounding. It was friendly, polite even, but it unsettled me in a way I couldn't quite explain. Why was he texting me directly? And why did his words make me feel something I wasn't ready to name? I told myself it was harmless, that replying wouldn't mean anything. "Glad you enjoyed it," I typed back, my fingers hesitating before hitting send. But that one message opened a door I wasn't prepared to walk through. Marcus started texting more. Small things at first, like recipes he thought I'd like or jokes about the dinner conversation. But then it became more personal. Compliments about my laugh, the way I carried myself. I told myself it wasn't serious, that I could control it. But the truth was, every message made me feel something I hadn't felt in a long time. Seen. Appreciated. Wanted. And that's when the guilt set in. Was this infidelity? There was nothing physical, no line crossed in the way most people would define it. But emotionally, it felt like I was inching toward a boundary I'd promised never to cross. Ryan, of course, remained blissfully unaware. Or maybe he wasn't. Maybe this was what he wanted all along. He'd encouraged this, hadn't he? Invited Marcus into our lives, into my life, and now I was left to untangle the mess. So, let me ask you, is emotional intimacy with someone outside your relationship ever justified? Is it harmless, or is it the beginning of something far more dangerous? Because in those moments, I wasn't sure I knew the answer myself. I sat in the cafe, my hands wrapped around the steaming mug of coffee, though I couldn't taste a thing. My chest felt heavy, my mind racing, every second stretching longer than the last. I glanced at the door again, and there he was, Marcus. He spotted me immediately, his warm smile breaking through the tension in the air. For a moment, I thought about leaving, just walking out before he could sit down, but I didn't. He made his way over, his presence as commanding as ever, and when he sat across from me, it felt too close, too intimate, even though we were in the middle of a crowded room. "Thanks for meeting me," he said, his voice soft, his eyes steady on mine. I took a deep breath. "Marcus, we need to talk." His expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Something that told me he already knew what I was about to say. I met his gaze, my heart pounding. About us, about these texts, these calls. It's starting to feel like more than just friendly conversation. He leaned back slightly, his hands resting on the table, but his eyes never left mine. And then, without hesitation, he said it. "What if it is?" Those words hit me like a punch to the gut. My breath caught, and for a moment I didn't know how to respond. I had expected him to deny it, to brush it off as nothing, but his honesty left me unsteady. "Marcus, I'm married," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper, "to a man who seems determined to push us together, for reasons I can't even begin to understand." His expression softened, his voice dropping lower. "I know you are, and I respect that, but I also know what I feel when I'm around you, and I think you feel it too. I couldn't deny it, not to myself, not to him. There was something there, something I didn't want to admit, but it didn't matter. What mattered was the promise I had made, the life I had built." "I can't do this," I said, shaking my head. "Whatever this is, it's not right." Marcus leaned forward, his voice quiet but firm. "I'm not asking you to do anything you're not ready for. I just need you to know that I'm here, for whatever you need." His words were both a comfort and a temptation, and I hated how much they affected me. "I need space," I said finally, standing up, my hands trembling. "Please don't text me anymore." He nodded slowly, his gaze steady. "I understand." As I walked out of the cafe, I felt a strange mix of relief and heartbreak, like I had left something behind but wasn't sure if it was the right thing. But when I got home, that fragile sense of relief shattered. Ryan was waiting for me, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. "You met with him, didn't you?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. My stomach dropped. "How did you know?" "I saw the messages," he said simply, his tone even, almost detached. "And I wanted to see what you'd do." My chest tightened with a mix of anger and betrayal. "You were testing me?" I snapped. "Spying on me?" He shook his head, running a hand through his hair. "I wasn't spying, I was trying to understand. And now I see that you're struggling just as much as I am." "Struggling with what, Ryan?" I shot back, my voice shaking. "You're the one who started all of this. You're the one who pushed me into this impossible situation." He sighed, his shoulders sagging. "I wanted to shake things up, to break us out of this rut we've been in. But maybe I went about it the wrong way. For the first time in weeks, I saw a flicker of doubt in his eyes, and it hit me harder than I expected. "I love you," he said softly, his voice breaking, "and I just wanted us to be happy. Can you believe that?" I stared at him, my heart heavy with anger, sadness, and something I couldn't quite name. "Then stop pushing," I said finally, my voice trembling. "Stop trying to force something that's not us. If you really love me, you'll respect the boundaries we have. You'll stop putting me in these situations." He nodded slowly, his expression heavy with regret. "Okay," he said. "I'll back off, but please don't shut me out." I turned away, unable to face him any longer. I didn't know if I could forgive him, or if we could rebuild what had been broken. But I knew one thing for certain: the boundaries had to be respected, or there would be nothing left to save. So, let me ask you, do you think Ryan was genuine in his apology? Or was he just trying to justify his actions? Let me know your thoughts, because I'm still trying to figure it out myself. I sat alone in the living room that night, staring at an old photo of Ryan and me. It was from years ago, taken on a beach during one of our first vacations together. We were laughing, carefree, untouched by the weight of time or the complexities of life. I didn't recognize that version of us anymore. Somewhere along the way, we'd lost what made us, us. I thought about Marcus, his words, his presence, the way he'd made me feel seen in ways I hadn't in years. And then I thought about Ryan, the man I had promised to love through better or worse. The lines between them felt blurred for weeks, but in that moment, staring at that picture, I knew a decision had to be made. The next morning, I texted Marcus. My hands trembled as I typed the words, knowing they would change everything. "We need to talk." When we met later that day, I was determined to be firm. He greeted me with the same warm smile, but there was a sadness in his eyes, as though he already knew what was coming. "I care about you," I said, my voice steady despite the lump in my throat. "But this, whatever it is between us, it has to end." He nodded slowly, his gaze unwavering. "I understand," he said softly, "but can I ask you something?" I hesitated, then nodded. "If things had been different, would you have felt the same way?" His question hit me harder than I expected. It wasn't fair. It wasn't a question I wanted to answer, but I owed him the truth. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "But it doesn't matter. What matters is the life I've chosen, the vows I've made. I can't live in what-ifs. I have to focus on what's real." He smiled faintly, though the sadness lingered. "You're stronger than you think, Layla." As I walked away from that cafe, I felt a strange mix of relief and grief. Saying goodbye to Marcus felt like closing a chapter I hadn't meant to open, but it was necessary, for him, for me, and for the life I wanted to rebuild. When I got home, Ryan was waiting for me. He didn't ask where I'd been, and I didn't offer an explanation. Instead, I stood in the doorway of the kitchen and said, "We need to talk." He looked up from his coffee, his expression a mix of hope and apprehension. "Okay," he said, "I'm listening." I took a deep breath, my hands trembling. "I can't do this anymore, Ryan. The games, the pushing, the expectations. It's not who we are. Or at least, it's not who I want us to be." He set his mug down, his face serious. "I was just trying to help," he said quietly, "to give us something new." "I know," I said, my voice breaking, "but you didn't stop to think about how it would make me feel. You didn't ask if it was what I wanted." He nodded slowly, his shoulders sagging. "You're right," he said, "I didn't, and I'm sorry." The apology caught me off guard, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like we were finally on the same page. "I want to rebuild this with you," I said, tears streaming down my face. "But it has to be on our terms, no one else's." He stepped forward, pulling me into a hug. "We'll figure it out," he whispered. "Together." It was a small moment, but it felt monumental. In the weeks that followed, we started over, slowly, cautiously, but with intention. We talked more, about everything and nothing. We set boundaries, clear and firm, and promised to respect them. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't perfect, but it was ours. Looking back now, I realize how close we came to losing everything. Temptation isn't always a loud knock at the door. It's often a quiet whisper, one that preys on the cracks you haven't tended to. But love, real love, is in the work. It's in the effort to mend those cracks before they split wide open. So let me ask you this. Do you think temptation is inevitable in long-term relationships? And if it is, how do you stay grounded in what truly matters? Let me know your thoughts, because if I've learned anything, it's that communication, respect, and honesty are the only things that can carry you through. I sat on the edge of the bed that morning, staring out the window as the sun crept over the horizon. The house was quiet, the kind of stillness that felt heavy rather than peaceful. Everything that had happened, Ryan's suggestion, Marcus's attention, the lines I never thought I'd come close to crossing, it all felt like a storm that had finally passed, leaving wreckage in its wake. But there we were, Ryan and I, still standing, still together, even if the ground beneath us felt unsteady. I won't lie to you, it wasn't easy to pick up the pieces. Some days I wasn't sure if we even could. I've replayed every moment in my head more times than I can count. The night Ryan first suggested Marcus, the dinner where Marcus made me feel seen in ways I hadn't felt in years, the text messages, the laughter, the quiet temptations that crept into the spaces where our marriage had grown hollow. And finally, the decisions I made, the ones that drew a line in the sand, the ones that told both of them and myself what I stood for. But now, looking back, I wonder, was it all a breaking point, or was it a turning point? Ryan apologized, truly apologized, and for the first time, I saw the man I'd married, not the stranger he'd become in recent months. We've started talking again, really talking, about the things we had let slide for years. And as hard as it is to admit, maybe his suggestion, as flawed and painful as it was, forced us to confront truths we'd both been avoiding. Still, there's a part of me that wonders if the damage runs deeper than I can see. Can you ever truly rebuild trust when it's been tested like that? So now, I want to ask you, do you think a marriage can recover from something like this? Can trust and love truly be rebuilt after such a shocking experience? Share your thoughts below. I'd love to hear what you think, and if this story resonated with you, if it made you think about relationships, trust, or the boundaries we set for love, be sure to like this video and subscribe. There's so much more to explore. Stories of resilience, betrayal, and the paths we take to find forgiveness. Next time, I'll share a story that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about betrayal and redemption. You won't want to miss it.